for the listeners and for me, because I love hearing the stories and it takes me back to good memories. What's it like as a pilot when you get that call from the ground that they need support? They're in a tight spot, and you're going in to fly close air support. What is that like? When you're flying a machine like the Apache, and you're going to do work.
It is by far my favorite feeling. I have more combat flight time than non-combat flight time, and I really started to feel like I was in my A game when I would take off, especially when I was flying Apaches and responding to a tick or troops in contact. Like when I was flying Little Birds, we knew what we were doing. We're meeting the 47s at the RP, and we're going to be overhead, and we do our thing. It's very deliberate, very planned. But when you're just kind of poking around over Baghdad, and you get a radio call said, "Hey, we got troops in contact at this grid, this call sign," whatever situation update they can give you, that gets your heart pumping, and you pull every bit of horsepower out of that thing that you can and tip the nose over and just yank the guts out of it. Kind of briefing the front seater, you're making comms with the guys on the ground to get situation update, and just kind of trying to figure out what they need. Sometimes they just need you present.
Yeah.
Like they may not be in contact yet, but they just want your presence. Be able to request a low flyby or something like that, just to show force. But other times, like when Solder City really exploded and into March of 2008, we got our typical brief for that day, and or from the S2 update, but we knew the weather was bad. It was like a mile and a half in dust, which I know that mile and a half in dust doesn't seem like a big deal for if you're driving around, but when you bump into things at night with a helicopter, it tends to have pretty catastrophic results.
Welcome to the Leading with Vulnerability podcast. I'm your host, Yuma Barnett, and today I've had a lot of Navy and Marines and all kinds of stuff, but I finally got a good old Ranger buddy back here on the show. Former Ranger Charles Eastman, also a former pilot in the Conventional Army and the 160th, and we're going to get into all of that. And he's currently the Director of Strategic Partnership at Stop Soldier Suicide. That is a mouthful to say. Very important job, and for those of you that listen to my podcast with Michael Delsom, they work with the same organization at Stop Soldier Suicide, which I'm going to benefit here in about 6 weeks on March 2nd to raise some money for them, and we're definitely going to talk about that. But I'm going to quit monopolizing the mic here. I'm going to pass it over to Chuck. You good to go by Chuck?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Pass it over to Chuck, and we'll get on with this conversation.
Awesome. So first of all, thanks so much for having me, Yuma. It's like we were talking earlier, I do a lot of talking for work during the week, but it's infrequent that I ever get to tell my story in the military and kind of the early days, and it's kind of an unconventional route. So just happy to be here and have this discussion.
Yeah, well, thanks for taking just some time to sit here. And like most of my guests, when I have them introduce themselves, they take about 10 seconds. They don't tell us much. So it's my job as the host. I got to pull everything out of them because all of us most of us come from humble beginnings and then stay humble and we leave the military. But we don't mess around here on the Leading with Vulnerability podcast. We get right into the tough question right off bat. What is your definition of vulnerability?
Yuma, if you would ask me that question 2 months ago, I would have had a much different answer. So 2 months ago, kind of found myself in a spot where I needed a little extra support. So for once in my life, I actually have a therapist, and it's probably been the best decision I've made. So the vulnerability part to me really has kind of been unpacked in some of those discussions. She asked, like, just tell me a basic story of what you do overseas. And she's like, whoa, that sounds like a lot. And, we got really good at packing these, individual events away in our rucksack, and our rucksack's gotten really heavy over the years, whether it be through trauma or events or loss. So vulnerability for me is realizing that I don't need to have this hard outer shell, and I just need to be open and understand that it's cliche, but it's okay to not be okay. Right. And you don't have to stay in that space, and you can get help, and it's incredibly helpful.
Yeah. This is, the favorite part of my show is the beginning here, where I hear everybody's definitions of vulnerability, all a little bit different, but all very similar in the way it is, and the positive impact that it's had on people's lives when they discovered how to tap into the more vulnerable side of themselves and others. So
Yeah,
let's take it way back. You're a '90s Ranger, right?
I am.
Let me age you a little bit here. And so, what's your Army story? What's your 75th origin story? Why the Army? Why the 75th?
So this could take a hot second to tell you the story because it's a circuitous route to get there. So in high school, actually in eighth grade, I learned about the Air Force Academy, and I said, "Oh, I am going to go there, and I'm going to fly jets. All I want to do is fly F-16s." I mean, I read every book about Vietnam fighter pilots. I had every image of a cockpit. I could tell you the difference between an F-16A, B, or C today still just from looking at it, and that's all that I wanted to do. Unfortunately, to get to the Air Force Academy, you need some pretty stellar grades. And I didn't have those stellar grades, but I took the SAT enough times that the last time I took it, I got a pretty decent score. But by that point, it was too late to join the Army. Oh, I'm sorry, to go to the Air Force Academy. So I dabbled in school, did a semester at a local university in Maine, realized that wasn't for me, and needed to kind of figure out what my next chapter was. So I figured, well, why not the Army? Right? It was a brilliant decision. Hindsight being 2020, I might have gone the Air Force, maybe, but I wouldn't have the story that I have. So
That's right.
um, enlisted in '96, went to Fort Benning, 11. I was 11 X-ray. So I walked into the recruiter's office and said, I want to be a Ranger. And the recruiter's like, that's awesome. The best way for you to be a Ranger is to enlist 11 X-ray, get to Fort Benning, and just tell them you want to be a Ranger. They'll give you a contract. We all know that doesn't work.
Right.
Never happens. So I ended up in the 25th ID in Fort Lewis. I was fortunate enough that my team leader, Specialist Garland, or Donovan Garland, was a team leader in 175. Got out of the Army and then came back in. So you can imagine a specialist with an EIB, senior wings, and a Ranger tab and a line, just a regular leg company, was like next to God.
Right.
And I was fortunate that he was my team leader, and he treated us like young Rangers. I mean, if you didn't buff the floor to standard, he was knocking on your door at 3 a.m, dragging you out, smoking you, and then you buff the floor until you get it right. So I was fortunate in those early days to have that kind of influence, and I knew that kind of going to the Ranger Regiment was still an option. I just didn't know how to get there. I was literally next door to 275. I could look out my barracks window and see their fence. It was just so frustrating. So being a little disgruntled in a regular leg company, I ended up going to the library one day and saw this application for West Point. And I was like, well, hell, I'll give it a shot. There was a program that you go direct from enlisted to West Point. Turns out that my SAT score was good enough by that point. So I got picked up and went to the prep school and was doing well in the prep school. I was on commandant's list and dean's list. And our first sergeant at the time was kind of pretty kind of boring, a little so-so, not a very inspiring leader. And I was trucking along being a cadet candidate. And then one day we got a new first sergeant. This new first sergeant walks in his class A's and just built like a tank. And he walks up front and flips the table over. I see that he has a Ranger scroll on his right sleeve, and First Sergeant J.B. Spizo. And he was like the most inspirational, motivating person I've ever met in my life. And so I started to kind of think about my direction, and the idea of going to the Ranger Regiment was still in the back of my head. It became almost like an obsession at that point. So I resigned from the prep school, and it took the chain of command completely by surprise. Like I said, I was doing fine academically, and PT stud, young at the time. So I had to go through all like the wickets to tell him I was resigning. Finally got to Spizo's office. He's like, well, what do you want to do, Eastman? I said, I want to go to the Ranger Regiment, First Sergeant. Okay. Picks up the phone, dials a number. I don't know what it is to this day. He was like, hey, it's Spizo. And he was like, yep, I got a hard charger here that wants to go to RIP. And he hung up the phone. He said, go sit in the S1 office. I'm like, okay. Picks up the phone, dials a number. I don't know what it is to this day. He was like, hey, it's Spizo. And he was like, yep, I got a hard charger here that wants to go to RIP. And he hung up the phone. He said, go sit in the S1 office. I'm like, Okay, so I walked in the S1 office, and 2 weeks later, he walks in with orders for RIP with airborne school en route. So he had pulled some strings somewhere. To this day, I owe him the rest of my career. And when I did get my scroll pinned on at the end of the RIP graduation, I mailed that back to him, because that was a major boost to my career. And I've always tried to my career to kind of pay it forward in similar ways if and when I could. So I got to SECO 375, just immediately struck by the caliber of the people in my leadership team. It was like Major Foster, First Sergeant Hardy were my commander and First Sergeant. Sergeant Fuller was my platoon sergeant. Shrewsbury was my squad leader, and Sergeant Donaldson was my team leader.
Oh, wow.
CSM Donaldson.
Yeah, right.
And I was introduced to them, and then they all left to go to Germany for 2 weeks. And so I was then introduced to Staff Sergeant Adam Nash to be my rear D NCOIC. And that was an interesting experience for 2 weeks, getting the undivided attention of Adam Nash.
I've been there.
And I love Adam. We were supposed to go on a duck hunting trip with Sean Daniels this last week, and I had a work event that I had to do instead. But yeah, that was an eye-opening experience. But yeah, it was really just an interesting point in my career, and I was just like eyes wide open, didn't know what to expect. And then, like, you were a pre 9/11 Ranger as well, so life back then was different. I used to tell people it's like going on camping trips when you go to the field. You train hard during the day, during the night, and then you build a fire. If you don't have a tab, you got to stay up and keep the fire going or rotate shifts.
Yeah.
And it was like camping. You just, BS, tell stories about what you did last weekend, go to memory lane on Friday night. And, it was a different world. So yeah, it was, I guess to fast forward to 9/11, I was roommates with Kurt Donaldson, and we were supposed to have a 1300 work call because we're going to go to the field for 2 weeks. And we were on RF1, and he was like, "Chuck, wake up, we're going to war." I'm like, "What?"
I can hear him saying that.
Oh, I know. And I can still picture it to this day. And, we watched on the TV for a little while, then being on RF1, we're like, shit, we got to get to work. So we hauled ass into work, and, it would then GWAT rotations, and then flight school. And I can get into whatever details you want along the way. But the early days of my Army days are a little all over the place, but ultimately got me in the right direction.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you're right. We're definitely going to unpack all of that time, and we could probably just talk about your time in the 75th for the whole entire podcast. But for the sake of time, we're going to fast forward to a very, it's an important event in Ranger history. And like I said, Ranger. Most people they're very reserved with what they say. And I loved what I read on your LinkedIn when I was data mining you, is that leader on the ground for the global war on terror, conducted combat parachute assault in Afghanistan as a U.S. Army Ranger team leader. End of experience. That's it. Like mic drop, walk away. That's what it was. I remember sitting in Savannah, cussing you guys because third bat, jump bat. You guys get all the jumps, and we can argue all day, but it's because you're next to the head shed. But we'll keep moving. But what was that like? You just watched the towers fall. You guys got tapped in. You're going to jump into Afghanistan. I mean, what are the emotions? What is everything? When I bring that up and you start thinking about it, what comes to mind?
Man, it was, like I said, pre 9/11, being in the Army was like, it was fun. It was just, hanging with the boys. When the towers fell and the Pentagon was hit, like it was instantaneous. Well, this changes things. Yeah. And we were mad. We were on fire. So like I said, we were supposed to go to the field that day. We went into the company, started dumping all of our B and C bags, taking all the woodland stuff, putting in camp or desert stuff. And we got the brief from the commander of the first sergeant at the end of the day. He was like, "Well, we're not going to the field today. We're like, yes, we're going to war. He's like, we're going to the field tomorrow. We're like, what? So we spent the next 2 weeks out in the field, and shoot houses, flat ranges. And that was the most intense training that I'd ever done, because suddenly it was really real. You know, being a team leader, you have all these like regrets, like, oh, did I teach my guys how to do A, B, or C? So I had them wearing balaclavas and doing mag changes. We would spend hours in a shoot house, just, you know, just the three of us or the four of us, you know, no live ammo, just running through drills. So put like a really a laser focus on what we were doing. And the weird part that I look back on now is we didn't have any TV and we didn't have any radio. So we didn't see any of the 2 weeks following 9/11 on the news, which I see like every 9/11, they'll do like a special memorial. I'm like, oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Or I never saw that broadcast. So it's like 9/11 is like super fresh every year. So I learned last year, I was like, nope, not watching it. It's just one of those really triggering events. But yeah, so we didn't end up deploying until October 12th. Went to Masira. There was a lot of back and forth. Well, to back up a little bit, the biggest problem was they couldn't find a place to put us.
Right.
There weren't many countries that wanted to house us or base us out of. So we ended up going to Masira, and it was a lot of hurry up and wait at that point. You know, I was a team leader, so I wasn't taking part in the conversations of the tactics and the logistics and all that stuff. And then Shrewsbury came in. He was like, hey, we're going tomorrow. Like, okay, let's do it. So it was like this. It felt like the Super Bowl. You know, like being a Ranger was like all you dreamed of was an airfield seizure. You train so hard at it, and the one thing you want to do is a combat jump. So we were all pretty pumped. It was you could feel like this static energy just being around all the guys, like in the hangar, loading magazines and handing out real frags. And that was the first time I was loading up like a 1950 with, a little 20 round mag stuffed in an aircraft loaded, or putting real frags for a jump. It was just all this stuff that you had prepared for that you'd never been exposed to. So we're sitting there on the ground with our chutes on, and I can't remember who it was. They came around, they handed out 2 Dramamines each, because it was going to be an NOE flight it was like 4 hours to get up to the drop zone. So I took a Dramamine and I fell asleep before we even took off. It completely knocked me on my ass, and I slept until like 30 minutes out. They were like waking me up. I'm like, huh? Okay, let's do it.
Some things never change.
Yeah, I know. It was odd, because we were all just like seated, like, one guy's sitting between your legs, and you're sitting between somebody else's legs, and it was enough of it was different than like a training jump. So I remember when I was on the left side or right side of the aircraft, and when they opened up the door, there was this dust that filtered in. That dust that's in Afghanistan that just, you can't get rid of it. And it was just, you could, like the red light was on, but like this dust is kind of filtering in. And we got the command to go, and I jumped out, and I was immediately struck by how dark it was, like inside of a cow type dark. Fast forward after many years flying over the Red Desert with 0% illume, that's what dark looks like.
Yep.
And there's a couple objectives that were kind of burning. We had a pretty significant pre-assault fires for that objective. And it was so dark. I mean, you couldn't see the ground. Like even night jumps at like Benning, you can see like, you can see cities and towns, and you can kind of see the ground as it's coming up. There was nothing. And I'm just like, oh boy, well, we'll see how this goes. Like feet and knees together just forever, I guess. But I was fortunate, like one of the C-130s had popped a flare. And when it popped a flare, it lit up the ground. And I realized it was like 50 feet over the ground. I'm like, oh, there it is. And it was lit long enough for me to land and have a pretty decent PLF.
Did you lower equipment or not?
Nope, it had assault packs.
Yep.
And coming back from that mission, we learned that a bunch of guys got all jacked up, like broken legs and broken ankles, because they couldn't see the ground. I was lucky enough that I could see the ground. And then the other thing, there was zero wind. Like I landed and the parachute just like fell on top of me. I'm like, oh hell, how am I going to get out of this? So I ended up well, they told us we're going to leave the chutes there. We're just going to ditch them. So I cut my way out of it with a knife. I'm like, I'm never going to do this again.
Right. That's
and
right.
then I cut off a piece of parachute, stuck it in my pocket, and then we drug the bags to the kind of like a drop off point, and then we set up in a company assembly area. And like I said, they had pre-assault fires on the Taliban barracks for a good amount of time. So there was nothing left really, except for this one guy that I know all the other battalions give a shit about. The one guy comes wandering out of the barracks and walks into a company assembly area of pissed off Rangers, a month after 9/11, and it didn't end up well for him.
No.
But all the other battalions laughed like, "Oh, you shot a farmer. He had a rake. He wasn't armed." And the ROE for that objective was pretty loosey goosey. But yeah, I don't know why he walked in that direction. I don't know if he heard us. He certainly couldn't see us. I know that.
Yeah.
And he walked right in, and then the objective itself was pretty benign. We had rehearsed it a lot of times back at Benning. They had tape drills, and we had rehearsed it so many times. It's just like, oh, geez, here we go another time. The only difference being that like one of the towers in the corner that I was supposed to go clear was like riddled with holes from AC-130, and I was like, no, I'm pretty sure that one's clear. And it was all wobbly from, I think it took a 155 round or something. It was destroyed. I'm like, yeah, I'm not climbing up that thing. But it was like 4 hours on the ground, and we went home.
Yeah.
We did lose one C-130 from some mechanical issues. So we took 4 birds worth of Rangers. We stuffed them into 3, which was tight.
Fitting.
Tight. I was like standing room only, and I ended up falling asleep again on the way home, like resting my head on the buttstock of a 240. And it was just like, we got back to Masira. We learned that unfortunately Stonecipher and Edmonds had passed when their helicopter browned out. And then it was Groundhog Day after that.
Yeah.
Like there was, how the rumor mill goes around, like, oh, this is coming up. We're going to go here. We're going to do this. So we ended up going forward staging into a place. I don't know if the place has been revealed yet, but we ended up doing FARP security for a month, like 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 12 hours on. And it was the most boring thing I've ever done in my life. And then we went back. We were back for Christmas.
Yeah.
And we thought it was done.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an amazing story. And I'm sure you have some good memories of it. I have a couple questions out of it.
Yeah.
So as you're preparing for the jump, was there any Grenadier Raiders or any Panama vets still running around the battalion there that could shine any light or give any clue of what it was going to be like?
Let's see. First Sergeant, Phipps was a Somalia Raider, or not a Somalia Raider, but he was in Somalia in 93. Pippin was our first sergeant.
Okay.
So he was a Panama.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Yeah.
One of the platoon sergeants, I think, had some first Gulf War time with the 82nd. But yeah, there's really only one guy that had jumped.
Yeah.
And I wasn't about to go ask Pippin anything because he's still the scariest person I've ever met.
I agree. And it is funny, we deployed in December and relieved ACO 375 in Bagram, and it was just so odd those early days, right? It's just trying to figure out where we fit in the mix of the soft community and conventional forces, seeing if they could leverage us. It was a lot of just Groundhog Day, like you said, trying to find our way. But for those of us that stuck around, it caught up over the years, and we got plenty busy, and we're going to get into that a little bit.
Yeah, lots of work.
Yeah. So how much more? When did you leave the regiment and go to the flight route?
So for your first deployment in end of 2001 into 2002, we were in JRTC. So we were at JRTC when Roberts Ridge happened.
Yeah.
And they told us the news about the Rangers that had been lost. And JRTC was kind of like a culture shock. Like, why the hell are we going to this training course when we had just gotten back from combat? But we were fortunate enough that Colonel Votel was on site with us, and he told the JRTC staff, he's like, look, you're not putting these guys in the box for 2 weeks, making them walk around. This is how future operations are going to work. They're going to deploy, like, these barracks is like your COP or your FOB, and you're going to rotate in and out of there by helicopter every night and do missions. So it was different than most JRTC rotations, which was nice. Got a couple jumps out of it, and it was JRTC. but we got back from that, and I was in a squad leader meeting. Shrewsbury he had gone somewhere, so I was acting squad leader, and my platoon sergeant, he said, "All right, guys, put it out to your Joes. There's a job that opened up at Fort Bragg to be the JSOC CG's driver." And I raised my hand. It was one of those days you're just kind of like over it.
Yeah.
And we thought the war was done. We, Tora Bora, we thought we got Bin Laden. Things are wrapping up. And I had kind of dabbled the idea of flight school, so I knew that would be a good way to, get a letter of recommendation from a general. So I said, "I'll do it." And Sergeant Sire was like, "No, Chuck, put it out to your guys, see if they want to do it." I said, "No, I'll do it." He's like, "You serious?" I'm like, "Yep, I'll do it." So
You still a team leader at this time?
yeah, still a team leader, and thought the war was done. Went to JSOC, worked with General Daly, and before I knew it, I was back in Bagram. And all my guys from SECO 375 were back in Bagram too, and they were walking around doing these movement to contacts. I'm like, what the hell did I do? Why am I? I'm a driver, and overseas is a element of doing security. You're at least carrying a gun all the time, but I'm watching the boys go out, and I would get so worried. I know they were doing an operation. I would go to the jock and I would watch the Predator feed. I'd watch infill, I'd watch actions on, and I'd watch exfil, and I wouldn't go to bed until the birds were wheels down. It was like this guilty feeling, like I shouldn't have left. I left them hanging. I left an inexperienced team leader to take over my job. It's just like all these feelings of guilt. But yeah, it ended up working in order to get to flight school.
Yeah. So what was it like to go to flight school back? Were they in need of pilots there? Was the process hard to get through? I know it's kind of ebbed and flowed over the years. What was it like for you?
Yeah, it totally has ebbed and flows over the years, especially by platform. So I went to flight school in 2004. Yeah, 2004. And we had big classes. There was like three platoons or three companies. Yeah, three platoons all at once, which is a lot. And flight school was great. I mean, I felt like I was missing out in the war, of course. But again, I thought that would be wrapping up at any point. But going through flight school and like having a CIB and a muster stain, I got treated pretty well by the cadre. They didn't give me too much of a hard time. The flight school is like my, beside my time in the regiment, like I always look back on the times I'm most fond of. First being in the Rangers, that I look back on those days still as some of the best people I worked with, some of the best experiences, some of the best memories, some of the most fun. But behind that would be flight school, because I wanted to be a pilot. And it was just such a dream to wake up every day and go fly. It was awesome.
Yeah, that is awesome. So when you're at flight school, did you choose your platform there? Did you come out of there with flying the Apaches, or how did you get platform selection?
Yeah, so I knew in flight school that would be my one and only time in my military career I'd ever have a choice, and I would have to earn that choice by doing well in class. So I studied all day. I mean, I'd wake up at 4:30, go to morning flight line, be done with academics at 5, and I would study. I'd just eat in my room and I'd study until 10 or 11. I mean, all I did was study the weekends. So I ended up top of my class for primary phase and instrument phase, and then that's what determines the order of merit list for who gets to pick. And like I mentioned earlier, there kind of ebbs and flows for platform needs. So like the Army needed a ton of Black Hawk pilots, and they only had 2 Apache slots, 1 58 slot, and 1 Chinook slot. So I was fortunate enough, I got my top pick and I picked Apaches. To me, it was just like, it kind of continued my warfighter mentality of just being out there and being overhead. And I just happen to like guns and things that go boom. So it was a great way to fill that niche.
Yeah, it's a great place for a former Ranger team leader to go. Good platform. So what was your first assignment out of flight school?
I was 4th Squadron, 3rd ACR at Fort Hood. And we were the 2nd squadron to get the new, what they call MTADs, which is the new, like on the bucket, on the front of the Apache, you got the FLIR bucket. And the older Apaches, it was just called the TADs. And the FLIR was not great at all. but the new MTADs was like game changer.
Yeah.
Like first battalion, 82nd, they were shooting IED in places that's 7 kilometers away
Oh wow.
because the visibility and the level of detail was incredible. So we had to kind of do a little bit of a train up for that new system. And then we ended up deploying to Iraq in November of 07.
Okay.
So that was my only conventional flying assignment.
It was 07, pretty kinetic at that time in Iraq. Was it for you guys?
Yeah, so it was kind of coming off the backside of a really kinetic point, like the 06 timeframe. A lot of kinetic ops. Apaches they were shooting every day. We got there in November, and we didn't pull a trigger until March of 08.
Oh wow.
I mean, there might have been like one or two engagements of like an IED cache or some gun truck that was abandoned, but I didn't pull any triggers till March of 08.
Yeah.
And then from there, it was busy for about 3 months.
Yeah. So for the listeners and for me, because I love hearing the stories and it takes me back to good memories. What's it like as a pilot when you get that call from the ground that they need support? They're in a tight spot, and you're going in to fly close air support. What is that like? When you're flying a machine like the Apache, and you're going to do work.
It is by far my favorite feeling. I have more combat flight time than non-combat flight time, and I really started to feel like I was in my A game when I would take off, especially when I was flying Apaches and responding to a tick or troops in contact. Like when I was flying Little Birds, we knew what we were doing. We're meeting the 47s at the RP, and we're going to be overhead, and we do our thing. It's very deliberate, very planned. But when you're just kind of poking around over Baghdad, and you get a radio call said, "Hey, we got troops in contact at this grid, this call sign," whatever situational update they can give you, that gets your heart pumping, and you pull every bit of horsepower out of that thing that you can and tip the nose over and just yank the guts out of it. Kind of briefing the front seater, you're making comms with the guys on the ground to get situation update, and just kind of trying to figure out what they need. Sometimes they just need you present.
Yeah.
Like they may not be in contact yet, but they just want your presence. Maybe they'll request a low flyby or something like that, just to show force. But other times, like when Sadr City really exploded and into March of 08, we got our typical brief for that day, and or from the S2 update, but we knew the weather was bad. It was like a mile and a half in dust, which I know that mile and a half in dust doesn't seem like a big deal for if you're driving around, but when you bump into things at night with a helicopter, it tends to have pretty catastrophic results. So we didn't plan on flying. We had weather minimums that we wouldn't fly less than 2 miles of visibility. So we're sitting in the kind of the jock up room and just kind of fiddling around, and the battle captain runs down. He's like, "There are 8 troops of contact in Baghdad right now. You need to launch and do a weather pattern to see what you can do." So our the AMC for the flight, Kirk Irvine, he had a lot of experience in the 101st flying Apaches. So he was like, he's one of those guys that just wants to get in a fight, not in a bad way, not maliciously, but when there's a fight and there's guys on the ground, he's like, he'll do anything. He's like, he told me, he's like, "Chuck, we're going to do a weather pattern. The weather is going to be good." I was like, got it. I hear you. So we took off and did a weather pattern. We were based out of Taji, and there's a fence on the east side of Taji that was a mile and a half. We always knew it was a mile and a half away, just for visibility's sake. We took off. I was under goggles, couldn't see the fence. And I told Kirk, I'm like, "Yep, visibility's good. Let's go." So we flew down the east side of, kind of coming out of Taji, kind of hooking around the east side of Baghdad. So there's no ground lights. And we knew there weren't any towers, there weren't any wires. And we were at, a couple thousand feet, but it was to the point where I had my flight page up because I couldn't see the ground, and I was looking at the IR strobe with a Kirk in front of me, and that was it until we got over the city. And that night we had, but like the feeling en route is like, there's so much pressure. Like you don't want to get it wrong because you can't take that bullet back. You can't take that hellfire back. And showing up on a scene, when you don't know what's going on, you don't know where the bad guys are, you don't know how many of them are there, you don't know the friendly composition. Um, there's just a lot of really deliberate discussions that are going on between the cockpits, between the front seater and the back seater, and then between the two aircraft, and then the ground force commander. Um, it was a lot slower and deliberate than I thought it would be, just because of all the uncertainty and ambiguity, because we didn't have a deliberate planning process. We didn't have a COF, we didn't have a GRG, we didn't have a fires net, like we did in the 160th. So it gets your attention in a hurry.
Yeah, that's funny. I think a lot of people, and myself included, before I got in a few gunfights, you always think it's just going to be like chaos, but it's always kind of slower and more methodical than you expected, especially when
Yeah,
you're bringing in aircraft overhead to start dropping ordnance. That's not something that you take lightly and do,
yeah,
willy nilly out there, because if you mess it, like you said, if you mess it up, catastrophic things could happen. And we've both seen that side of it as well. So when you're flying on the conventional side. At what point did you say, "Hey, it's time to assess to go, go to 160th"?
so I always knew I wanted. Well, I didn't always know, but going back to being a private in the Rangers, we did a Kilo 22 for an MLAT, rotary wing MLAT. And this particular Kilo 22, we had like broke the record for Fort Benning for the number of Bangalore torpedoes. So we were like way back in the woods, and we blow the Bangalore in the breach, and then two H6s came over, and they were shooting the breach. I'm like, what are those, and how do I do that?
Yeah, yeah,
I was like, that looks like fun. And then we ended up back in the assembly area. We're just kind of cleaning up stuff, and I just saw some of the pilots, and they had like these funny little dots in their rank. I'm like, what the hell is that? And it was a warrant officer. So I didn't know what a warrant officer was. I still wanted to fly, but I knew nothing of it. So it really was. It kind of came full circle to do that.
yeah, yeah. So, what all platforms did you fly when you got to the 160th?
I only flew the AH-6 Little Bird.
That's it.
Yep.
Is that normal?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So to come full circle to that Kilo 22 breach, I was talking about that story in the company one day, and the guy that was flying that mission back in '99 was still in the company.
Oh, really? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, Jay Rathbun. He was like, "Oh yeah, that was me. That was me and Matt Brown." I mean, once you're there,
yeah,
you're there.
yeah,
You don't leave. There were
yeah,
there were guys there that were like, I had met one or two CW5s in all my aviation time,
yeah.
and that we had five in the company when I got there.
Oh, wow.
I
Yeah,
mean, guys would just show up, and they I don't want to say camp out by any means. I mean, they're flight leads, and they're the very cream of the crop
yeah,
for aviators and mission planners and tacticians. So that they were needed there. But yeah,
yeah,
once you fly a platform, you typically stick with that platform.
yeah. Did you find the transition? Was it difficult going from the Apaches to the Little Birds?
Oh God, yes. Oh, the Apache is like, I always equate it to like a Lincoln Navigator. It's got like all the features, all the bells and whistles, like moving map. You can get queuing in your eyepiece, so you can see where targets are on the ground. You can find aircraft in the air with the FCR. I mean, it was just like really bougie. I mean, it had heating and air conditioning. Um,
Yeah,
so like I'd pull up in the FARP in like August in Iraq, and it's like 120 degrees outside, and the FARP guy would plug in, and or the refueler would plug in, and I would say something to the front seater, and I'd be like, "Man, it's cold in here. Are you cold?" And the guy that's plugged in is like, "Really, sir?" It's like, "Oh, sorry, guys." So it was super super bougie, and I remember getting to Green Platoon, and like we were doing all the basic navigation. So BNAV is one of the phases that they kind of take you way back to basics, and we're just navigating off a map. Time distance heading off of a map. I'm like, well, we never do this for real, right? And then I started to look at the cockpit, and it was just like really basic. And I wasn't flying at the point; I was still just navigating. And then when I got to um, the portion of the training where I got to actually do the flying, I mean, flying the Apache, you could literally like adjust the collective with one finger. And the Little Bird, there's no hydraulics, there's no flight stability augmentation, there's nothing. So it is trying to kill you like every single time you fly that thing, and it was tough. It was a major transition, and then we always flew with doors off overseas. Yep. So my first rotation was in August of 09, and we had the doors off. And the first time we took off out of the FARP, I felt like somebody had like put a blow dryer in my face. It was just like all these like elements and experiences that I never experienced before, that were just like really shocking.
Yeah.
It was a big transition.
Yeah.
They're totally different machines.
Yeah. They're amazing machines, and from the the ground perspective, all my time in the 75th, there's not enough A's to go around to every platoon that's going out that night. So it was always kind of fun that night. You go, what support aircraft we got? And if you had the Little Birds, it's like it's just something about having that sucker up there buzzing around with guns on. And then back in the day, we were infilling off the skids of those suckers, and that's amazing and fun and the worst ride of your life, right? Because you get off, you do Iraq, especially, you're flying an hour out of the green zone, and by the time you get off, your abs are it's worse than any ab workout that you've ever done. And you got to you're landing on a lip of a roof somewhere about to go assault the building. But those are amazing aircraft, amazing. And I assume you flew both on the attack side, and you've carried some of us around on the skids, or no?
No, it's so they got two companies. They have Alpha Company 160th, which is the MH6 with the planks for the passengers, the customer, and then B Company 160th. It's just AH6. So that it's like there's some pretty good rivalry between the two. Yeah. It's kind of like you get a couple different Ranger battalions together, and someone's going to end up fighting.
Yeah.
It was always good.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's funny you mentioned the riding on an MH. Going back to that JRTC story. I had an opportunity to do an infill on MH. I'm like, oh hell yeah, I had never done it before. I'm like, this is it. I'm sitting up front, and this is gonna be the best ride ever. No one told me what to do. They didn't tell me like face forward, so I just clip in, sitting sideways, and it started to rain. And
oh man,
it was like fun up to about 60 knots. And then after 60 knots, I felt like someone was like stabbing my face with needles from the raindrops.
Yeah,
and my head was getting twisted. And by the time we got to the LZ, I could barely even move on clip to do it. I was like, that sucks.
Yeah,
I'm like, I'm not doing that again.
Yep, absolutely. So which company were you again? Remind me.
In what, Rangers?
No, in 160th.
B Company.
So that's with the attack aircraft, right? So similar to the last question, it's got to be completely different flying in to do a gun run on an Apache than it is bumping up in an A. Different situations too. A lot of times it's very hot down on the ground, and you're right there in the thick of it, right overhead. What's that like?
Yeah. So when I was flying Apaches, our engagements were 1.5, 2, 3 kilometers away. With Hellfires, I guess. The Little Bird. I mean, to give you an idea of how close we're shooting, my first night gunnery, once I was in the company, my first night gunnery, I was shooting. They're actually inert rockets, and I hit some mud, and a huge ball of mud came up and went right through my canopy. So we knew something had hit the aircraft, but it was dark, and I shine my light. There's this big ass hole in the front of my canopy, and I'm covered in mud. And I was a brand new BMQ. I'm like, I am so fired. I'm like, I am so fired. And they razzed me for a little while with it. But yeah, the proximity is really the biggest thing. And then the kind of the violence of action.
Yeah.
Apaches, you're kind of doing these, lazy orbits, and you have standoff, and there's nothing really too aggressive about the flying. But boy, when you're flying the Little Bird up close, breaking off the target, going back to not having hydraulics or stability, anything, that collective just wants to drop out on you. So it's like an arm workout every time you're in the break, and you're feeling some G's, and you're yanking it around. You're trying to get eyes back on the ground force and the target, and just maintaining SA at all times. But it all happens really quick. It was a lot faster than flying Apaches, because like Little Birds, we had the mission brief, we had a COF, we had a GRG, we had a JTAC, a trained JTAC that was up on the net at all times. And, that was the radio out of the 4 radios we're listening to. That was the one that was loudest.
Yeah.
Because if you hear like your call sign say, uh, you're cleared hot, you're like, okay, or like, hey, this is me, this is my position, target marked by, cleared hot, and that's that fast.
Yep.
And then it's just everything moves really quick after that.
Yeah. For the people that are listening that came from this community, they know exactly everything you're talking about. But for those who haven't spent time in the military or whatnot, when you have guys like Chuck flying overhead, flying those small aircraft, my first experience, one of my first live fires in the regiment at Fort Knox, was the hot brass coming down, going down my body armor, getting stuck in there and getting yelled at because I wasn't IMT fast enough, as I was getting burned by the brass that was coming off of the attack aircraft as we were doing that training mission. But the 160th and the regiment, we have a very close relationship because a lot of us, chewed the same dirt and came, started in the same barracks and went through RIP together. And then we stuck together for 20 plus years during the GWAT. And with that, all your time in the Ranger Regiment, flying aircraft over 2,000 hours and combat flight hours, which is amazing. What was your most challenging day in the uniform?
So my most challenging day was actually, I know this doesn't answer your question, but it really covers 2 days, or days that were back to back. So I was deployed to Kandahar when Extortion 17 went down. So that was 6 August. And then 2 days later, Dave Hortman and Steve Red were in a training accident at Fort Benning, and they were killed. So it very quickly reminded me of my mortality, and how you can take the most elite of the elite in Gold Squadron and lose most of them all at once.
Yeah.
Or to have Steve Red was a 175 FSO or FSNCO. And Dave Hortman was Distinguished Honor Grad at Ranger School, like the best 2 dudes you could ever want on your team. And both of them just like physical specimens. And it's just like, it really brought me back down to earth in a hurry. One being a combat operation, one being a training accident. And I never got to go to their memorials because I was still deployed. I never got to mourn for them. We did our ramp side ceremony, with the rifles stuck in a sandbag and boots and dog tags and a picture, but I didn't get to be with their family and tell them how much they meant to me or go to the service. So that was a tough run for that period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. But a lot of things are tough in the military. Losing people, actually, just all the deployments and saying bye to family all the time is difficult. But I don't know about you. It's probably say I wouldn't trade any of it for the world because the good days outweigh them. So on the flip side of that coin, what was your best day? And something you look back, you might still have a chuckle when you're driving in the car by yourself or something.
My best day ever in uniform was the day that I assessed for 160th. Like to drive onto that compound and to be handed this like folder of maps and target binders and all this stuff. I finally felt that I had made it. Yeah. It was up to me to do the hard work, but I had made it. And I was just so excited. I can picture to this day. I mean, I even know it was like a Lincoln, like one of those large Lincoln sedans I got out of Nashville International Airport for a rental, driving up to Fort Campbell and driving on that back road for the Bell Station Road, going in the back gate. It was just such an amazing feeling of just sheer excitement and joy. A lot of hard work to still be done after that point. But that day being kind of invited, it was an honor just to be invited to assess. And that I know that's not a very exciting day, but it was something that I looked forward to doing for 10 years. Yeah. And finally be able to get there was really it was a great day.
Yeah, that's awesome. And thanks for sharing that. So how many years did you do before you retired and transitioned out?
20 years.
20 years.
Nearly on the dot.
No.
Yep.
Perfect. I feel you. I was right there too, right about the 20 years. So how was your transition? What led to your transition? What drove that decision to hang it up?
There was some pretty significant personal stuff going on. My son was born with a neuroblastoma, which is a type of infant cancer. So that was 2012 when we were dealing with that. So I literally redeployed the night before he had to go have surgery for it. to have the cancer removed. Not to keep anybody hanging. He's cancer free and he's healthy. And 11-year old that just likes to play Fortnite and baseball. And he's awesome. But there was a lot of like introspection of like what's really important in my life and what do I need to focus on. So I even turned down a promotion. I turned down W-4 to retire at 20, which is a real thing. You can do it. You got to send headquarters DA a letter, and they let you know that your promotion is no longer. And that was a hard decision. But the transition itself, I say to this day, it was the most lucky, fortunate series of events ever. I was still on terminal leave. I was sitting in the corner of my house drinking a cup of coffee, and my wife got a call from one of the guys she had worked for with Leadership Nashville. This guy named Jim Tully. He was a platoon leader in 375 when McChrystal was a company commander. So he knew my background, and he was working for L3 Harris, and they were looking for someone that could do business development for ground and aviation soft pursuits. So, I mean, there are some of us out there that did both ground and air from soft, but he just happened to know my wife, knew my background, so he gave me a call, and within a few months, I was started at L3 Harris in a business development role, which I look back on. I mean, it was just like I pinched myself, to walk out of the Army into this semi-corporate role. And I got to work with all of my buddies that I used to work with before, go to Quad A or AUSA. And, I wouldn't call them my buddies. They're significantly higher ranked than I were, but I knew them, and that helped build the relationships and build business. And I enjoyed it a lot. But I spent a ton of time on the road. Like Jim told me, he's like, yeah, I'll be about 50% travel. Yeah. It was more like 75, 80. Sometimes I just live in a hotel. And that was hard on the family too.
Yeah.
So I ended up without a great plan leaving L3 Harris, which led me to where I'm at today with Stop Soldier Suicide.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that in a second. So, I don't think you lucked into the role or anything. You put in a lot of hard work over your career and made a reputation for yourself. And the role might have found you easier than it finds some, but I don't believe for a minute that you just kind of fell into it, knowing you and knowing your background. But if somebody's out there, they're about to enter the transition process, they're thinking about it. What advice would you give them?
Oh God, start early.
Yeah.
Like I said, I kind of vacillated on stay in, get out, stay in, get out. So I didn't start my transition until 6 months prior. I remember going to the SFL TAPS place, and they're like, "Oh, so when you transition?" I'm like, 6 months. They're like, "Oh boy, we got some work to do with you." So I had no idea of what I was going to do next. So advice would be A, start early. B, start exploring some of these other organizations that can help you walk that journey and really translate some of your skills for what you did in the military into just what that looks like in the civilian world.
Yeah.
Organizations like the Commit Foundation or Hire Our Heroes or Skill Bridge. There's so many wonderful programs out there now, but just start early and don't be too proud to not get your VA benefits and register with the VA. I was too proud. I didn't file anything with the VA until a year and a half after I retired. My boss, will tell you about Jim, was like, he asked me, I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm fine. I'm not broken. I don't have anything wrong with me. He said, Chuck, you're being lazy. And I was like, not many people call me lazy, but okay, I'm listening. And he's like, look, when you're my age, shit's gonna be broken, and you're gonna need to fix it. And you're entitled to these benefits, so go get them.
Yeah.
So just start early. See if you can go down that journey of figuring out what you want to do and who you want to be.
Yeah. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Start early. Check your ego at the door.
Yep.
And you're right. Go get the VA stuff. Use all of these benevolent organizations that are out there to your advantage, and you can have a successful transition. So let's talk about what you're doing now. The strategic partners, strategic partnerships, director of strategic partnerships at Stop Soldier Suicide. It's like an NCOER bullet reading that.
Yeah.
How did you come about that role? How'd you learn about Stop Soldier Suicide? How'd you come into it?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said my title because I still trip over it. So yes, I do that. So when I left L3, um, I had a really nice summer just to really kind of focus on being with my family. I'd go to the pool every day with my son. We played pass with the football every day in the pool, and it was just a really great summer. But can't live like that forever. So I reached out to my good friend, hell, he's my son's godfather. We met in JSOC back in 2002, so we had some time between us, and he retired out of the unit the same day I retired out of the 160th. So we both were kind of going through the same journey of trying to figure out like who we are and what's next. So I reached out to him. I was like, dude, I got to find something more meaningful. I'm like, if I got to do this civilian thing, and I got to be able to do something that like inspires me each day, like gives me purpose and meaning. He's like, well, let me introduce you to a buddy of mine. He's a co-founder of a nonprofit called Stop Soldier Suicide. I'm like, okay, sure, sounds good. So I talked to Nick Black summer of 2019 for the first time, and after 5 minutes, I was like, holy cow, I am in. I don't know where I'm going to do it or how I'm going to do it, but I'm in. And they didn't even have a position for me at the point. I started talking with the CEO. I did a few kind of unofficial interviews along the way, but they didn't have a role. So it took them about 6 months. So they came up with a role that they created. So at that point, I was the community affairs manager. So the hypothesis being that we would kind of grassroots effort, like a kind of a movement, if you will, at the state level. So I was going to focus on North Carolina. So that my first day was March 2nd, 2020. So little mission planner that I was breaking it down by an op order. I still have an op order PowerPoint from how I was going to break this down. I had where most veterans are living, where the veteran organizations are, the VFW, American Legions. I had PowerPoints, and then COVID hit, and we all went home. Fortunately, we had the technology to support it. We all had laptops. We had a version of Zoom that back then it was called Blue Jeans. It stunk, but now we have Zoom. We had Slack. So we literally just folded up our computers, all went home, and didn't miss a beat. And the CEO is like, it's fine. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Like everybody was thinking. And then it just kind of, it stuck. And I didn't have a community. Like I couldn't go I couldn't manage anybody. There's nobody there. Everyone was in lockdown, or they were too scared to come out or do anything. So I started kind of evolving my role, just kind of, sui sponte. I was just like, well, I'll just make it work. So I started reaching out to a lot of national organizations, like Lone Survivor Foundation. Now it's Operation Red Wings Foundation. Learning about how we can collaborate together, how we can work together, share resources, refer clients back and forth, how we can get more clients. So my role got a new name to it. About halfway into it, but I came into Stop Soldier Suicide not knowing much of anything about suicide prevention. Literally nothing. I'll go back and say nothing. I knew of one active duty guy that took his own life, actually the 160th. But otherwise, I didn't know the significance of the problem. And when I was talking with Nick Black, that first conversation, and he shared some of the statistics, I was shocked. It became personal all of a sudden. Like, my wife's a veteran, I'm a veteran, my buddy Derek's obviously a veteran, my dad's a veteran. Like, the more I started to learn about it, the more I learned the statistics, and the more I learned just some of the sheer numbers. I mean, I can spit statistics and numbers at you all day. But the biggest one that jumped out to me, like, you and I are warriors. We fought for our country. I fought side by side with great men and women. And to learn that 4.3 times more post 9/11 veterans have died by suicide than combat was heart-wrenching. Like, I worked my ass off to keep guys protected on the ground. I flew in ridiculous weather and did ridiculous things, put my life at risk to protect them on the ground, and I couldn't help them when they got home or when they're still on active duty. So it really inspired me to just stay with the organization. We're doing great stuff, and we've served nearly 5,000 clients, and we haven't lost an active client to suicide. So the model that we have is evidence-based. It's proven, and I'm proud to still be here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And those numbers are crazy when you sat down and look at the numbers of suicide among the, the military veteran community. It's shocking. So I thank you for your service. Thank for you for what you're doing now. It's amazing to still serve, but I want to make you unemployed, right?
Yeah.
I want you to have to search for another job because I would like to end this suicide uh, epidemic, pandemic problem, whatever you want to call it, that's hitting the veteran community. And how do we do it? What do we got to do? What if what do we do as veterans, as non-veterans? How do we put an end to it?
I personally think that the most important steps that are taking place these days are exactly what you're doing. Exactly like the Legends of the 75th podcasts that, having some of these sheer absolute legends in the community talk openly about their mental health and some of their struggles. We're all really proud about how tough we are and how far we can walk with a pack on our back and how we can just shove bad memories down and not cry when taps is being played, when your friend's being loaded in the back of a C-17. But that's not the definition of toughness. Like, having these conversations, um, it's so critically important. I was doing a little bit of my data mining myself, and you said something that vulnerability doesn't equal weakness, and I love that, because I think the narrative is changing, and I think that warriors that have fought for the past 20 years are starting to look around and say, "Man, is this who I really am, and how can I improve?" Because suicide itself is um, so complex.
Yeah.
There's a book called Rethinking Suicide by Dr. Craig Bryan, who's on our scientific advisory committee, and he defines suicide as a wicked problem, and a wicked problem is broken down by even more complex problems. So there's so much that goes into suicide. There's childhood trauma. There's trauma from combat. Like, I learned like half of our clients didn't even deploy, which I came into the role thinking like all of our clients would be traumatized from combat or combat operations. Nope, half of them are never even deployed. There's a lot of childhood trauma. There's substance abuse. There's substance abuse disorders that increase impulsivity when somebody's in a bad place. Um, there's we experience a generation of warfare that no other generation ever has.
Yeah.
Like, you and I are talking timelines. That's 20 years ago.
Yeah.
What generation has ever fought for 20 years? I remember being a kid and, someone would say like, "Oh, Uncle so-and-so did 2 tours in Vietnam." We're like, "Wow, 2 tours." You're like, "Yeah, he volunteered for the second." You're like, "Wow." Like, you look at guys like us, like, I'm not beating my chest in any way, but we kept going back over and over and over. We kept volunteering, and the same people are kept fighting. So I think there are different elements of veterans, like within the soft community, that did it over and over and over, and even conventional too. Like, I have conventional buddies that have more time overseas than I did. Um, but it's a complicated issue, and we all say, well, our mission is to reduce veteran suicide to civilian parity by 30%. Excuse me, you might want to go back and edit that one. So our mission at Stop Soldier Suicide is to reduce veteran suicide to civilian parity by 2030, which is a 40% reduction. Because suicide has been part of society for thousands of years.
Right.
We're not going to eliminate it. We're not going to get the numbers down to zero. But veterans shouldn't be twice as likely to die by suicide compared to civilian counterparts.
Right.
Suicide is the second leading cause of death for veterans that are 18 to 35. That shouldn't be that way. So breaking down barriers, having the conversations, encouraging people to seek out help. I think it's complex. There's a lot that's going to need to change. Transition experience, that can always be improved, but it's not the silver bullet, if you will. But it's a complex thing. But I think guys like you that are proactively creating a space to have the conversation, to tell their story, to be vulnerable. That's a huge first step.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that about this, and that's the whole reason for this podcast, right? Selfishly, for me, I love just sitting down and talking to you guys.
Yeah.
We've never, I can't remember ever being in a room with you, but I could sit down and talk for you for hours because of what we went through together, and that's like fires me up and gets me, makes me looking forward to the next day. And I think that's what a lot of guys feel like they don't have that anymore, and gals. And
Yep.
the truth, that's not true. You do. And
Yeah.
if you don't have a friend to reach out to, you that's why Stop Soldier Suicide exists, because you can reach out to them, and they can take care of you. And I appreciate what you're doing there. And you're right, it'll probably never be at zero, but it's way too high where we're at now. We got to do something about it. So
Yep.
um, it's last question here. Everybody gets it. If you could go back and talk to Chuck, in the recruiting office, you're about to head out to basic training. What advice would you give that young man?
So the advice I'd give myself um, is to really be present and enjoy the journey. I was plagued with imposter syndrome nearly every step of the way. Like, hey, I graduated RIP. Like, we started with like 120, we graduated 30. Like, oh, he must have missed me somehow.
You're right.
Or I graduate Ranger School, or top my class in flight school, and especially when I got to the 160th. Walking into Owen's hangar and setting up a desk, flying little birds. I'm like, they're going to find out sooner or later. So I would tell myself that I'm gonna hopefully experience some amazing things, but to be proud of it because I earned it. You even hit upon it earlier. You're like, well, it's kind of interesting background or interesting career path. Like, if I could take that back and not have the imposter syndrome, and to really own it, and just have a healthy ego about how I got there and why I was successful, but not try to dismiss it and diminish it, which only took away from it ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I wish I would have enjoyed my time in service a little bit more, and and hung my hat on those big moments a little bit more. Graduating Ranger School, graduating RIP. I didn't invite family to those things because that's just what I
I
was
didn't
supposed
either.
to do. I mean,
Right.
that was just the next thing I had on the list of things to do, and I regret not spending more time just to enjoy those little moments. And that's something I hear from everybody that comes through the show. I think we're all
Really.
very similar.
Yeah.
Imagine that. Uh,
Yep.
Chuck, thank you so much for taking some time to come on here. And for all you the guys that are listening, uh, March 2nd, live stream. Going to play Call of Duty for 24 hours with a few other Rangers, and we're going to raise some money for Stop Soldier Suicide. So tune in, donate. There'll be more information to follow. And for everybody likes the podcast, like, share, subscribe, do all those things I need you to do to make sure that this gets in front of the person that needs to hear it in the moment. So, Chuck, thanks again. This has been awesome, and we'll catch everybody else on the next episode.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Yuma. I really appreciate your time.